Hello, so I guess my name's Amelia, and I'm really happy to give you a warm welcome to this exciting lecture. It's part of our lecture series about botanic gardens across the Commonwealth, and I'm very excited to introduce Richard Atkin, who will give a historical overview of Australian botanic gardens. Richard is a Melbourne-based writer, historian, and curator, specializing in the history of gardens and designed landscapes. He has prepared conservation plans for many of Australia's most significant historic places and curated exhibitions for leading cultural institutions. He was a founding member of the Australian Garden History Society and for many years co-edited the Society's journal. Richard's books include the Oxford Companion to Australian Gardens, Gardenesque, Botanical Riches, Seeds of Change, The Garden of Ideas, Cultivating Modernism, and Planting Dreams. During this talk, if you have any questions, please just pop them in the chat. There will be a time at the end where we'll answer the questions, and I can answer the ones on within the chat on your behalf. Also, before we get started, just ensure that your microphone is muted. And once Richard shares the presentation, under View, you'll be able to select side by side to be able to see both Richard and the presentation together. On that note, I'm thrilled to hand over to Richard.
Well, welcome from Melbourne, Australia. Hello also from Naarm on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation. In giving this lecture, I acknowledge all people of the Kulin Nation, as well as those who are traditional custodians of land throughout Australia on which our botanic gardens have been developed. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I seek wisdom from their knowledge as custodians who have lived on and cared for this country for tens of thousands of years. The Daraban Creek, seen here, runs not far from where I sit. It starts in country within the Kulin Nation and runs into Birrarung, which you may know as the Yarra River, and then to the bay, and then to an ocean that connects us all. European colonisation of Australia in the late 18th century occurred almost simultaneously with the emergence of botany as a scientific endeavour, much expanded from its previous medicinal emphasis. Plants from all parts of the world new to European botanists were being collected and described, setting up parallel knowledge systems to those evolved by Indigenous and First Nations people. The global transshipment of plants was a haphazard business, but by the late 18th century, considerable knowledge existed on ways to optimise survival rates of live plants and, crucially, viable seeds. With this came greatly enhanced imperial ambitions, seen most notably at London's Kew Gardens under the stewardship of Sir Joseph Banks and at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. Botanical historian Ray Desmond reminds us that Joseph Banks had identified 3 floristic regions of particular interest to Kew: Australia, the Cape, and South America. Australia remained the least explored of the 3, and its geographical position posed major challenges in transporting live plants. Kew may have spearheaded this transshipment of plants, but it was the commercial nurseries in London that carried the dissemination of such plants forward, particularly the establishments of William Malcolm, Lewis Kennedy and James Lee, and James Colville. In cool climates, the dry, protected environments of greenhouses suited Australian flora admirably, and through promotion in periodical publications such as the Botanist's Repository illustrated here, this diverse flora sparked a craze during the decades either side of 1800 for Botany Bay plants or New Holland exotics in Britain and parts of Northern Europe. The earliest Australian botanic garden was established in Sydney in 1816 on Farm Cove, as seen on this plan of Sydney from that date. By 1818, Hobart too had a modest walled garden for government use, but it was not until the late 1820s that this site was managed more closely as a botanic garden. Both of these gardens had developed from earlier government gardens set aside for the acclimatisation of plants, indigenous and exotic, especially those of utilitarian value such as fruits and vegetables. I have spoken of Kew, but other botanic gardens formed exemplars for Australia. The early medicinal and physic gardens still carried weight as a model, as well as gardens of utilitarian origins, such as the Company's Garden at the Cape of Good Hope, seen here. Government-funded botanic gardens, such as those at Glasgow, Edinburgh and Glasnevin, were well known, as were many European examples. Well known too were Horticultural Society gardens, such as those of the Horticultural Society of London at Chiswick and the Caledonian Horticultural Society at Edinburgh, both placed on a firm footing during the 1820s and dependent largely on private subscriptions. Totally dependent on private funds were the display gardens of large commercial nurseries, such as London's Hackney Nursery, widely acknowledged as the equal of many botanic gardens. The botanic gardens at Edinburgh, Glasgow, seen here, and Glasnevin in Dublin had all been established by the early decades of the 19th century. Of Glasgow, J.C. Loudon commented that the plan, shown here from his encyclopedia, combines variation of landscape and scientific arrangement in a very eminent degree. If we skip to New South Wales, Elizabeth MacArthur, from a notable colonial family, wrote in 1832 that a portion of the Sydney Botanic Gardens, known as the Lower Garden, was laid out to a plan of the Glasgow Botanical Garden of Dr. Hooker. It will be very beautiful, she wrote, and it already assumes a very tropical appearance. So let's look at Sydney. Here's a plan from the 1830s, around the time that Elizabeth MacArthur was praising the design. Loudon's comments regarding the admixture of landscape and scientific arrangements at Glasgow can be interpreted clearly here, with the oldest section of squared beds contrasting with the newer and more naturalistic layout so admired by Elizabeth MacArthur.
Richard, I was just going to mention if you can just speak up just slightly.
Okay.
We can hear you okay, but just a little bit higher, okay?
Sure.
Thank you.
At this time, other Australian botanic gardens were in contemplation, especially at Adelaide, where two largely unsuccessful attempts were made in the 1830s to garden on the banks of the Torrens River. I've mentioned that the display gardens of the early plant nurseries formed de facto botanic gardens, and from an Australian perspective, probably none were more significant than that of the Hackney Nursery in London, run by the Lodige family. Loudon not only illustrated this plan of his nursery in the Encyclopedia of Gardening of 1834, but also repeated claims that Lodige may have had just as many plants in cultivation at Kew. In Australia, the pioneering nursery of Thomas Shepherd drew on this precedent. Shepherd had worked as a landscape gardener under Thomas White and was an acquaintance of Humphrey Repton and had run a small nursery in Hackney before emigrating to New South Wales. It is significant that when Governor Burke visited the Darling Nursery in 1834, local newspaper reports referred to it as Mr. Shepherd's Nursery and Botanic Garden. Later that decade, John Bailey emigrated to South Australia and after a short stint as government botanist and overseer of the first botanic garden in Adelaide, turned his hand to the nursery business, which he named Hackney Nursery after the namesake London establishment in which he had worked for nearly 2 decades. Aside from royal, state and commercially funded botanic gardens, one other mode had a great impact on early colonial Australia, and that was the concept of a semi-private botanic garden maintained by subscription, usually through a botanical, horticultural or zoological society. I have mentioned the London and Caledonian horticultural societies, but of comparable importance was the garden within London's Regent's Park, established in the late 1830s by the Royal Botanic Society. This circular site and mix of central axis flanked by naturalistic paths and beds was widely known through the press. This prospectus from 1838, published in the Civil Engineer and Architects Journal, shows one of the competition entries for the layout, and although not identical to the final scheme, nevertheless bears many similarities. In 1839, the Sydney Gazette reported that the novelty of this undertaking consists in the arrangement of the grounds, in imitation of gardens of different countries, with a collection of plants indigenous to each, and adaptation of the architectural embellishments to their respective regions. The rare plants of New Holland, Van Diemen's Land, New Zealand, etc., will occupy one portion, noted Hobart's Colonial Times, adding, "We have extracted this passage from the Atlas," that was a contemporary London newspaper, "as a piece of interesting intelligence and as an encouragement to our own infant society." That infant society was probably the Tasmanian Society, modelled on venerable British, Royal, Scientific and Literary Societies. This was one of several such early societies in the colony, which were soon subsumed under complex circumstances into the Royal Society of Van Diemen's Land. The earlier government botanic garden was ultimately transferred to the new society, and although the plan of Hobart that I show here is from 1856, the squared beds and flued wall present in the 1840s are clearly evident in the central portion of the plan. For several decades at least under Royal Society management, Hobart's Botanic Garden prospered and was the centre of a large plant distribution network. In the north, a botanic garden was also established by the Launceston Horticultural Society from 1841 on a former government reserve, seen in the centre of this 1835 plan. Sir John Franklin, Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land from 1837 to 43, was a patron of the Launceston Society and a key figure in promoting science in the colony. The Society's initial objectives included climatising of English plants, experimental research into the island's native plants, preserving pure seeds, establishing a garden affording healthful and useful recreation, and also a station for collecting and disseminating valuable, useful and ornamental plants. These ambitions, as far as the garden was concerned, proved overly ambitious, and in the mid-19th century, the fledgling Botanic Garden was transferred to government control and ultimately formed the basis of Launceston City Park, now a public garden of outstanding cultural significance. While in Tasmania, it is worth visiting a short-lived yet ambitious venture from the same period, located in the Australian bush of Lenna Valley, just north of Hobart. Its creator, Jane Franklin, an educated Londoner and accomplished traveller, was married to the governor, and the Lady Franklin Museum, a Greek revival temple, was erected in 1842 to 43 at her own expense to house a museum and library and other collections, including botanical specimens. It was also to have an adjoining botanic garden of Australian flora on its 400-acre site, although the Franklins departed in 1843, just after the building was completed, and sadly the site was not developed to fulfil its founder's aspirations. But its intent is a significant early marker in Australian cultural history. By this period, Australian colonial botany had already attracted its fair share of controversy, not least in the competing aspirations of the imperial government and local colonial governors. All the gardens I've spoken of so far largely predated the re-establishment of Kew Gardens, or at least predated the ripples that this major upheaval brought to the world of botany and botanic gardens from the 1840s onwards. In the 2 decades since the death in 1820 of Sir Joseph Banks, Kew Gardens had fallen into neglect, and a report by botanist John Lindley, released in 1840, recommended major changes to its management. This resulted in the former Royal Garden becoming a government-based botanic garden with greatly enhanced facilities and a renewed zeal for economic as well as scientific imperatives as the hub of an imperial botanic network, and a new name, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, and a new director, William Hooker, formerly of Glasgow. The changes wrought at Kew had a pervasive influence on all subsequent Australian botanic gardens, yet such outposts continued to reflect diverse influences. Charles Moore began work on refurbishing Sydney Botanic Garden in 1848, consolidating the importance of this government-funded botanic garden and bringing considerable experience to the task. Moore was claimed by Kew as one of its own, and Moore himself even repeated this claim. Yet if true, his tenure there must have been very short, as his major experience was in the Royal Botanic Society's garden in Regent's Park, under the directorship of Robert Marnock. Charles Moore's brother David was by this date director of the Glasnevin Botanic Garden in Dublin, and it is worthy of note that another Irish gardener, an ultimately influential journalist and author, the young William Robinson, was a successor to Charles Moore at Regent's Park. In her opening lecture of this series, Kate Telcher used Adelaide Botanic Garden as one of her case studies, and I wish to return there now to look at some aspects that she had only brief time to briefly touch on. Following several unsuccessful attempts to establish a botanic garden in Adelaide, a conclusive start was made in 1855 under inaugural director George Francis, and the view here, something of a garden-esque capriccio, shows the garden at the close of the Francis directorship after a decade of development. Francis had enjoyed a modest yet successful career in London as a botanist, author, journalist, and publisher. He came close to inventing a plant case similar in principle to that of Nathaniel Ward, and indeed, Ward was a proposer of Francis for fellowship of the Linnaean Society. Loudon and Marnock both accorded positive reviews of several books by Francis. Many of his innovations can be seen in other Australian botanic gardens, but for the purpose of this lecture, George Francis and his work in Adelaide form a fascinating case study. This pair of plans shows on the left an initial plan of progress from 1855, and on the right, a plan of 1864, showing the garden just prior to the untimely death of George Francis. The initial tasks included potting and retaining all the remnant river red gums, shown by green dots, which provided maturity to the landscape, shaping the natural watercourse into two lakes with islands, and commencing work on the main axis, unsurprisingly, the closest part of the garden to the main city centre. Erection of a cottage and plant shed, shown in red, were also early priorities. The brown shows the land that was trenched for planting, and the orange indicates the formed gravel paths. The plan on the right demonstrates that Francis achieved considerable progress in just one decade, even if some of the area to the top or north was still largely embryonic. In the bold plan, we can also see a clear echo of the Royal Botanic Society's garden in Regent's Park, with its central axis and circular motifs, and influence acknowledged by contemporary observers. George Francis placed considerable emphasis on garden buildings and structures, ranging from rustic rockwork and a centrally placed fountain to quite sophisticated buildings, such as the Conservatory, top left, Wood Museum, top right, and Trellis Pagoda Shelter, lower right. The Conservatory, flanked by greenhouses, lent a rugged Antipodean Palladianism to the garden, while the Greek temple form of the museum and the Oriental influence of the pagoda suggest a witty nod to their respective positions west and east in the garden. In building the reputation of the Adelaide Botanic Garden, Francis recognised, for instance, the value of having a publication which could be exchanged to build up the Botanic Garden Library, and he achieved this in 1859, 2 years after the garden opened to the public, with a catalogue of plants under cultivation. In this way, by exchange, he was able to build the library at Adelaide and place less reliance on having to purchase books or journals from his own funds, an all too common problem for colonial botanic garden directors and government botanists. As with many colonial scientific institutions, networks thus established by exchange of publications also enhanced exchange in other areas, assisting with a vast global system of plant exchange, usually proudly documented in printed annual reports, which in turn spurred further cooperation. But it would be a mistake to think that colonial botanic gardens were entirely stocked by plant exchange with kindred gardens. In fact, most were sourced from commercial plant nurseries, overseas, interstate and local. Commercial nursery proprietors were generally nimbler than the bureaucratic apparatus of even the most efficient colonial government departments, and their business acumen was in many cases combined with expert horticultural knowledge derived from experience at the celebrated metropolitan nurseries. These three invoices for Adelaide from the 1850s and 60s not only document contemporary plant collections, but assist in gaining a picture of the growing maturity of the Australian nursery trade. As Francis was laying out the Botanic Garden in Adelaide, Ferdinand Müller was busy doing the same at Melbourne, as shown on this plan of 1864, a plan so large and complex that it's only realistic to reproduce a small detail. The 1850s had seen a remarkable increase in Australia's population, with gold seekers flocking to New South Wales and Victoria. It was also a decade that witnessed growth in the number and sophistication of Australia's botanic gardens. This was in part due to a burgeoning colonial wealth, but it also owed a significant debt to the dynamism and expertise of individual directors. Yet plant acclimatisation and botanical endeavour also jostled with recreation and leisure in the quest for hard-won funds and public support. Müller, perhaps of all the colonial Australian botanic garden directors, most closely matched the Kew ideal of placing botany as the central plank of a botanic garden. He enriched the herbarium at Melbourne to one of international standard, made Melbourne a far-reaching botanical publishing centre, greatly enhanced the library, oversaw an unprecedented plant distribution network, and fashioned a garden that, if not universally regarded for its design, was exceedingly popular amongst visitors. Many of the plants Müller and his intercolonial colleagues distributed went to botanical gardens and other reserves in regional towns. This network was especially strong in Victoria, where government policy aided the establishment of generous reserves, many designated as botanic gardens. Geelong, Portland, Hamilton, White Hills, just north of Bendigo, and Ballarat all had botanic garden reserves set aside in the early to mid-1850s, each entrusted to a local committee of management, often with a strong link to the local municipality, but always within the overreaching jurisdiction of the colonial government. In terms of layout, the strong geometric grid of colonial surveying, seen here at Hamilton, was generally not translated to the garden design, which in general favoured naturalistic over formal layouts. Regional botanic gardens are now a highly regarded feature of Australia's botanic garden network, and this network had an especially strong presence in Victoria and also in the various Queen's Parks in Queensland. This example at Koroit in Victoria's Western District shows a typical regional botanic garden of the mid to late 19th century. Ambitious in plan, and only the right-hand portion of this design was ever implemented, this was a site where Melbourne Botanic Garden and its director provided design advice and plants. If such gardens were not strictly botanical or scientific, they were certainly experimental as empirical trial grounds for the reception, acclimatisation and propagation of imported and Australian plant species, and provided a focus for gardening of far greater sophistication than was expected of a local public park. A distinctive feature of Australia's metropolitan botanic gardens was that they commonly shared a larger site with an adjacent government house, domain and parkland. This example shows Brisbane Botanic Garden, established in 1855 under the directorship of Walter Hill, one of the earliest and indeed one of very few Kew-trained gardeners to direct an Australian botanic garden. Some pressure was taken off metropolitan botanic gardens, at least by the creation of a parallel system of public parks and gardens, where recreation, leisure and pleasure were dominant priorities. Sydney's Hyde Park, set aside in 1810, was by many years the earliest public garden in Australia, and given its early date of reservation, amongst the earliest in the British-speaking world. Melbourne developed especially a culture of fine public gardens, with many regional centres also possessing fine sites. Often such public gardens were in the form of an esplanade, boulevard or lakeside setting, and the presence of bandstands, rotundas and memorials often spared but did not entirely erase the need for botanic gardens to incorporate such structures. Free entry to Australian botanic gardens was, by the mid-19th century, an important factor in their popularity. Most botanic gardens incorporated a variety of shelters for visitors, ranging from small summer houses to quite elaborate seating pavilions. Unsurprisingly, given their late 19th century construction dates, many adopted a rustic design ethos. Where botanic gardens did excel was in the provision of specialised plant houses, mostly of timber laths for shade, but also some glazed hothouses for tropical plants, such as in Adelaide, depending on the prevailing climate. What Charles Moore had been gradually implementing at Sydney over several decades, with his crowd-pleasing mix of botanical groupings and picturesque effect of the kind advocated in Britain by Robert Marnock and William Robinson, was in Melbourne implemented with a rush by William Guilford from 1873. The rustic shelter in my last image was located at Melbourne Botanic Garden. And if I pull the zoom out slightly, we can see the wider subtropical landscape effect that Guilford created there in this view. Guilford had been installed as director at Melbourne after Muller had been ousted as a result of his perceived emphasis on botany over ornament and leisure, banished to the herbarium where he saw out his days productively, continuing as government botanist. This plan of Melbourne, of which, again, this is just a small detail, published in Guilford's second annual report dated 1875, owes a debt to Repton with his before and after views. Guilford here is in red and Muller in black. It depicts with devastating clarity the changes Guilford was making and about to make, completely reshaping Muller's slightly stilted landscape design to a more fashionable naturalistic landscape where science and pleasure coexisted in an apparently effortless fusion. William Guilford, of Huguenot descent, had emigrated with his parents and siblings in 1849. His father Michael had worked in the London nursery of Joseph Knight, and once in New South Wales established his own exotic nursery at Sydney's Double Bay. William Guilford, still in his early 30s when appointed at Melbourne, had undertaken botanising trips to the Pacific Islands, was a partner in his father's nursery, and evidently possessed considerable horticultural and landscape design skills. Guilford's design has long been seen as somehow having a direct lineage back to the 18th century English landscape garden. But if we look more closely, it is apparent that Guilford was as much influenced by contemporary French garden design, which saw its pinnacle in the creation of large Parisian parks of the Second French Empire and the unveiling of Parc des Buttes-Chaumont for the 1867 Paris Exposition, an exposition, incidentally, that Guilford's colleague Charles Moore attended with William Robinson. In combining botany and ornament, Guilford quickly made Melbourne Botanic Gardens a landscape design exemplar, not only for contemporary colonial botanic gardens, but as a widely admired landscape of the sort then becoming popular amongst wealthy owners of private gardens. Each of the Metropolitan Botanic Gardens maintained a library, with the large centres of Adelaide, Melbourne and Sydney each possessing outstanding collections. Many volumes, especially periodicals, were obtained by exchange, but colonial legislatures also funded acquisitions. A key feature was the sub-collections of books that were formerly owned personally by Botanic Gardens directors, which ultimately came into the institutional collections, and the library of Francis and his successor Richard Schomburg in Adelaide, Muller and Guilford in Melbourne, and Charles Moore's successors, Joseph Maiden, were notable in this respect. Here we see a group of books from the collection of William Guilfoyle and the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, now held through the zeal of his younger colleague Joseph Maiden in the library at Sydney Botanic Gardens. Of note here is the wide range of British books, from Thomas Whately in the late 18th century to George Glennie, Jane Loudon, and David Thompson in the mid-19th, and even Christopher Dresser, surely reflecting a sophisticated level of interest and knowledge. So far, I've said very little about botanical research in Australia's botanic gardens, but by the late 19th century, each of the nation's capitals possessed a substantial herbarium, particularly at Melbourne and Sydney, and participated in an international interchange of dried specimens. Despite these local facilities and knowledge, this was one area where Kew retained an overwhelming advantage over colonial botanic gardens through its political clout and sheer bulk of herbarium specimens of Australian species. The experience of Melbourne's colonial botanist and Botanic Gardens director Ferdinand Müller and the preparation of a Flora Australiensis is worth noting, as despite Müller's preeminence in Australian botany, the refusal of Kew in the 1860s to cede authorship of an Australian flora to a colonial author saw Kew's preferred in-house systematic botanist, George Bentham, prepare this massive 7-volume set. By the late 19th century, Australia's botanic gardens were beginning to mature, and design zeal was being replaced by consolidation as directors aged and trusted lieutenants were beginning to succeed visionary leaders. A comparatively late achievement of Richard Schomburg in Adelaide was the establishment of a Museum of Economic Botany, an outstanding building and collection which survives to the present. By the turn of the 20th century, what might be termed pure botany had been supplanted by applied botany. That is, the taxonomic cataloguing of Australia's indigenous flora by those working in botanic gardens had been increasingly overshadowed by research into economic uses of plants for agriculture and productive horticulture, and the display of exhibits in museums such as that erected by Schomburg. Some botanic gardens even fell from the jurisdiction of lands departments to those of agriculture. In Sydney, we coat the botanical pill with the sugar of a pleasure garden, commented Joseph Maiden in 1912. The majority of our visitors take their botany mildly, while he added that the public rarely understood that botanic gardens consisted of living plants and dead plant specimens. There was also during this era some disquiet at HQ about Australia's independent streak, with hand-wringing from the Kew Guild about the paucity of Kew-trained gardeners working in Australian botanic gardens, let alone directing them. While acknowledging the work of Kewites Philip McMahon in Brisbane and C.E.F. Allen in Darwin, the Guild praised the published lists in the Kew Bulletin for showing at a glance the distribution of Kew-trained men holding government posts at home, in India and the colonies. A notable feature, however, the journal added, has been the failure of our comrades to obtain such positions in Australia. In 1896, with the appointment of 2 young women to the staff at Kew, the Journal of the Kew Guild also found reason to lament the rise of lady gardeners. There was a predictable list of masculine excuses as to the unsuitability of women in the workforce, letting fly with a stream of prejudicial venom. We do not see how an educated, self-respecting woman can hope to be a wife and mother and a gardener as well. We protest with the utmost vigour against any proposal to make gardening a convenient profession for old maids, or even for the unsexed young ones. In Australia, women were largely absent from gardening roles in botanic gardens until the mid-20th century, but had long played a vital role in other ways. Many women assisted botanic gardens in the collection of herbarium specimens. Women were active as botanical artists, with Margaret Flockton at Sydney perhaps the best known, and women played an active support role, often living in very modest cottages in the Botanic Gardens their husbands were superintending. Here we see the picturesquely named William Gilpin in the 1890s, a veteran gardener from the British estate of Lord Ellington, with his wife and family at the foreman's residence at Adelaide Botanic Gardens. South Australia, noted for its progressive streak behind its conservative facade, included a woman on its Botanic Garden board long before the other states, with university-trained botanist Edith Osborne, also known as Mrs. T.G.B. Osborne here, having been appointed in Adelaide as early as 1815. As the 20th century progressed, more inroads were made with this gender imbalance, particularly amongst professional administrative staff of libraries and herbaria attached to the Botanic Gardens. Finally, in the post-war era, female gardeners began to come up through the ranks of the apprenticeship or training systems, often against the odds in the heavily male-dominated world of public horticulture. Here at Adelaide, we again see progressive attitudes at work in 1956, with the first intake of female trainees under progressive new director Noel Lothian, who had taken the directorship less than a decade earlier, aged just 32. During the 1950s, Adelaide's director Noel Lothian also re-established the 19th century practice of trial plantations across disparate parts of South Australia, this time using plants that might be adapted to poor soils and low water regimes. Not only did this provide practical outcomes, but it also built on and enhanced knowledge and research within the herbarium and the garden. Australian plants were a general focus, tapping into the burgeoning interest in bush gardens. Two significant new botanic gardens were opened in the mid-1960s, the Australian National Botanic Gardens in Canberra, shown here in a recent photo, and Kings Park and Botanic Garden in Perth. Both had long gestations, and each provided their respective capital city with a major botanic garden, completing a network of all of the Australian capitals. These two gardens highlight Australian species, a common planting policy in many of our newer botanic gardens. Australia now enjoys a network of over 100 botanic gardens, large and small, with some of the more recent examples being established or maintained by local rather than state governments. Educational programs have also been increasingly incorporated into public programs of Australian botanic gardens, widening their appeal to school groups. Apart from the new gardens mentioned, another feature of the mid-20th century was the creation of satellite sites to complement older established metropolitan botanic gardens. These have included Wittunga and Mount Lofty in Adelaide, Mount Tomah and Mount Annan in New South Wales, Mount Coot-tha in Brisbane and Cranbourne in Melbourne. Such sites often came with some remnant bushland or early plantings, and this often influenced the design and collection policy for each site. In such gardens, the emphasis was generally heavily or exclusively focused on Australian flora, but other concerns such as geographic or ecological groupings also drove their planting and design. In general, wild source collecting and careful plant records were accorded a new priority. This is Wittunga Botanic Garden shown here, established by the Botanic Gardens of Adelaide in 1965 on the nucleus of an earlier private garden, having specialised collections of Australian and Southern African plant species. In recent decades, I would say since the 1980s, there has been a great revival of interest in our regional botanic gardens. Initially, this was directed at rejuvenation of ageing and often decaying plant collections and landscapes. But in the last decade or more, this revival has seen botanic gardens become revalued by communities as special public places, and community pressure has often forced the removal or amelioration of adverse impacts caused by mid-century caravan parks and sports facilities, to name just two major forms of encroachment. The Castlemaine Botanic Garden, shown here, was one of the first in Victoria to be rejuvenated, and in recent decades the site has been expanded, maintenance has been dramatically upgraded, buildings and collections have been conserved, and once again the garden is a place of considerable community pride and high use. One further example of recent conservation work is the partial reconstruction of the once famed Fernery at Ballarat Botanic Gardens. Like Castlemaine, this garden has seen considerable rejuvenation in recent decades, and this is merely the most recent of several worthy projects. It's worth mentioning here that as gardens are being revalued, local municipal councils are, by and large, devoting considerably increased resources to maintenance and development of botanic gardens. In this, they are often ably complemented by community-based friends groups, which individually and collectively are creating an admirable and impressive basis for channeling newfound enthusiasm. Given the valued and often privileged sites of our botanic gardens, they are well placed to accept and promote new interpretations. Often these are ones that have little to do with botany, but much to do with community engagement. The various after dark light shows, which have been popular in recent years, have often attracted huge audiences. For botanic gardens, such events can serve as an introduction for many visitors to places they may not ordinarily visit. At best, these installations build on the attributes of the site. The danger with such events and interpretations is that they may have little connection to the site and run the risk of trivialising and commercialising precious community assets. In 2016, Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi artist Jonathan Jones presented a work entitled Barangal and Dara, translating as Skin and Bones, a vast sculptural installation stretching across the Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney. It drew on the ghosted outline of the former exhibition building on this site, the Garden Palace of 1879, which burnt 3 years later with a complete loss of its permanent exhibits, including many priceless Indigenous cultural objects. Jones used 15,000 bleached white gypsum shields, replicating materials used in Aboriginal mourning ceremonies. A meadow of native kangaroo grass marked the former dome of the Garden Palace, and soundscapes were created in association with local Aboriginal communities. Such reimaginings of our past enrich public spaces, and our botanic gardens are well placed to facilitate and promote engagement with Indigenous culture, plant use, objects, nomenclature, and knowledge systems. Within botanic garden management, there is also now considerable energy being devoted to aligning research, design, and interpretation to contemporary issues and concerns. Water scarcity, climate change, plant conservation, and ecological biodiversity are all now part of the wider remit of our botanic gardens. These are being addressed through managerial rethinking, replanting, refashioned garden designs, enhanced interpretation, and new facilities such as the major new plant science facility at the Australian Botanic Garden Mount Annan in New South Wales. The example shown here is the new wetlands on First Creek, which runs through Adelaide Botanic Garden. Created within the last decade, this new facility will hopefully bring water self-sufficiency to the Adelaide Garden. With it comes considerable interpretive opportunities to educate visitors and local gardeners alike about issues surrounding water conservation. I started this lecture with a stream, and I'd like to end with one also. This is no ordinary river, but a highly representational watercourse that forms the interpretive spine of the Royal Botanic Gardens Cranbourne, the Australian plant satellite of the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria. Located about an hour south of Melbourne, Cranbourne has been created over the last few decades from a patch of degraded bushland to become a major garden worthy of sitting alongside its sister city garden, William Guilfoyle's design masterpiece in central Melbourne. Cranbourne's design is anchored by an arid desert landscape with wind-sculpted lunettes that serves as a central and inaccessible heart. Around this are watercourse snakes, starting on our right as a dry creek bed, then progressing anti-clockwise through rocky headwaters, cascades, a gliding river, and finally out of this shot to the most recently developed section, a coastal estuary. This marvellous image by photographer Peter Hart was taken about 15 years ago, and the garden has grown significantly since then, but it reveals the garden's programmatic interpretation with great clarity. I used this image on the title page of my book, The Garden of Ideas, and I'd like to end this lecture by noting that our botanic gardens are truly gardens of ideas. Through them, we can imagine the future by experimenting in real time. We can grasp design ideas that enliven our senses. And dare I say it, botanic gardens can be ideological sites where ideas grounded in science can help influence fundamental egalitarian rights to a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was fascinating. And thank you so much for introducing us all to such amazing places around Australia. I'd like to take some questions now. So if anybody has any, I'll start with anything posted in the chat. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask Richard, please feel free to post them in there and I will set them aside for him. So our first question, Richard, comes from Stuart Reed. He asks, would you care to say more about competition between botanic gardens, distributions, and commercial nurseries, jealousy, and interface?
Well, of necessity, tonight's lecture has had to have been a fairly brief overview, but there was certainly a good deal of angst caused, particularly in the 19th century, between botanic gardens on the one hand, who were distributing plants, and commercial nursery proprietors on the other, who wished to sell plants. There was also quite a bit of ill feeling caused by the distribution not only of plants, but even things like flowers to the hospital and things like that. I know William Guilfoyle in Melbourne got a number of raps over the knuckles for doing that. Guilfoyle also caused rather a lot of angst by doing a lot of garden design work, perhaps as director of the Botanic Gardens, perhaps as a private consultant. It's very hard to know which, but certainly there's probably half a dozen Botanic Gardens in Victoria that were designed by William Guilfoyle and are now seen rightly as Guilfoyle creations, but whether he was officially sanctioned to do those, I'm not sure.
Right, continue.
Sorry, I'm seeing a picture of a Rococo light fitting here, so there's not much help to me.
Yes, sorry, it's just focused on somebody's camera, but you can continue. Sorry about that. It was just
well, that was really all I wanted to say, that it was certainly a contested area in the 19th century between, fledgling nursery proprietors on the one hand, who are trying to make their living out of distributing plants, and botanic gardens on the other, who are distributing them for what they saw as the public good.
Okay, thank you very much. Did anybody else have any questions? I'm just looking in the chat here, or if anybody would like to raise their hand and make mention to anything. I thought, Richard, I guess one I was kind of looking at too was just if you could explore a little bit more about the buildings that sat within the gardens and maybe just expand slightly on that. I know you touched on it a few times, but if there was more to say to that.
Well, I was aware when I was invited to give this lecture that the title of the series is really the Botanic Gardens of the Commonwealth and their buildings. But I felt that if I just concentrated on the buildings, there would be a lot of material that perhaps wouldn't get covered. And particularly that early history, I don't think it's often recognised that a lot of the earliest Australian botanic gardens were created in that period before Kew was reformed. And so those influences of things like the commercial nurseries and the subscription gardens, I find quite fascinating and rather under-researched. But as far as buildings go, by and large, most of them were built of timber in the 19th century, so there hasn't been a high survival rate of very early buildings. So the ones that do survive were either extremely robust or have been reconstructed. So that's the first point I would make. Secondly, some of them were of rustic construction. So certainly some of the summer houses in Sydney and Melbourne and Geelong, for instance, had thatched roofs, which only had a finite lifespan. So they were the buildings that were really, I suppose, for the public pleasure, but the buildings designed for plants, many of them too were built of timber. So in many Australian climates, there was a need for shade rather than the protection of, from cold. So those buildings too have largely fallen away. The conservatories, of which there were only a few, haven't had a good survival rate either. And as Kate Telcher mentioned in her inaugural lecture, the one at Adelaide Botanic Gardens is really the peerless example. But there have been some very substantial new conservatories built at Mount Coot-tha in Brisbane and at Adelaide, Ballarat Botanic Gardens, Sydney. So there's some marvellous examples of a whole range of buildings that are either extant or have been built relatively recently. The one in the conservatory in Ballarat is really a minor masterpiece.
Okay, sounds wonderful. I have a couple more questions coming through too, so I'll field those now. So I have one from Kate Tessler. Do you see a connection between the establishment of botanic gardens and the spread of local horticultural societies in 19th century Australia?
There was only a handful of horticultural societies actually created botanic gardens, and the ones in Hobart and Launceston were the two that really sprang to mind. By and large, the horticultural societies used botanic gardens, particularly for their usually twice yearly shows. But the horticultural societies were fairly hit or miss affair. Some were quite long-lived, but some were quite short. There was often competing interests between amateurs and professionals. There were some horticultural societies aimed at gardeners, though, as was probably pretty much the case in the UK, there was a lot of fracturing of the horticultural societies. And so whilst they were great advocates for botanic gardens, they, I don't think, had a large influence on the design or the management of botanic gardens, apart from those couple that I referenced.
Thank you. I have one from Tim Enswell. Richard Mueller liked military bands. Sorry, my pronunciation, I realize is slightly off, but Golflo was keen on big concerts, and today we like light shows. Have things changed much? All the botanic gardens do include an element of culture and amenity in their charters, but yes, plants must be at their center.
Yes, well, I agree with Tim that plants must be at the centre, but I think, as I've tried to show, a lot of botanic gardens, particularly in regional Australia, really weren't able, they could aspire to that, but they really doubled as public gardens as well. And yes, some of them did have facilities such as bandstands in them, but I wouldn't say that they were in the majority. And yes, Mueller certainly did like the military band. Indeed, he was rather fond of military hardware. He had some Crimean War guns, which William Guilford had great pleasure in dispensing as one of the first acts when he took over in 1873. So yes, it's one of the eternal struggles in botanic gardens, how to balance the scientific and botanical imperatives with making places that politicians generally are funding, politicians generally like to see people having fun as well.
Another question we have from Peter Watts is there another place in the world where there is an equivalent collection of botanic gardens as exists in regional Victoria?
I'm not sure about that. Certainly the Victorian Botanic Garden network is a really exceptional one. There must be at least 40 or 50 such gardens, and again, not all of them aspired to or even reached great botanical heights, but nonetheless, they were designated as botanic gardens, and their committees of management took those quite seriously. I don't really know. Maybe, one of the historians who's like Donald McCracken, who's looked at botanic gardens around the world, would know the answer to that. I could go and look at his book in a minute, but I can't off the top of my head think of another example. I mentioned the Queen's Parks in Queensland, which Hill, the director of the Brisbane Botanic Gardens, supplied with plants and often design advice. And they were, I suppose, a sort of a miniature version of the network in Victoria. I don't know, Stuart Reid might be able to tell us more about, or Colleen Morris, about New South Wales. Certainly there's a lot of very fine regional botanic gardens in New South Wales, but and Charles Moore and Joseph Maiden and their staff certainly provide a lot of design advice. But I don't get the sense in New South Wales that it's such a coherent network as existed in 19th century Victoria.
It's Colleen, Richard. I think Victoria is pretty special for its network of botanic gardens. I don't think the New South Wales range of botanic gardens, although there's quite a few, really meets that. And Tim would be able to say, comment on that too, and I think he has in the chat.
Yeah, I could jump in just quickly, Colleen and Richard. Great talk, by the way. Yeah, look, I've not seen anywhere around the world that has that rich history that Victoria has in botanic gardens, and because of that money that was in Victoria at the time, and as you say, this kind of and Mueller and Guilfoyle and that kind of Kew influence, it just I'm pretty sure there was only one botanic garden in New South Wales around that time, but now more recently, people, there are some great gardens created across Australia, but that legacy, which we need to look after, I don't think occurs anywhere else in the world.
Do you have a more accurate number than I was able to produce about the number of botanic gardens in Australia, Tim?
Not in Australia, but I think it is. We often say it's 150 or 200. I think BGAN's Botanic Gardens of Australia and New Zealand membership is something like
I think it's 130 I saw on their website.
Yeah, that's right. And 45 or something are in Victoria of those at the moment. And there's so Victoria's got about the same number of gardens. It's lost a couple and gained a couple. But, if I look around, even I think China, interestingly enough, is probably starting to get the density of gardens that we have in Victoria, but mostly elsewhere, you just don't quite get that same regional coverage. It's interesting.
Something that I didn't mention and perhaps should have was the United States. And I think the influence of the US was probably more a general one than a specific one. I mean, the US was influential in things like, agricultural improvement at the end of the 19th century, irrigation schemes, big, sort of vast regional irrigation schemes. Certainly there was a great stream of publications came out of the US, particularly in the early to mid 20th century, when gardens like New York and Missouri sort of really were dominant in that kind of area. But in terms of individual influence, possibly at Brisbane, I know what I felt was the most direct influence from America. Certainly in Sydney, there was some, very good examples of American publications. But by and large, we've tended to look to the UK and to Europe more generally, Central Europe. there was a great number of German gardeners here and then quite a number of German botanic garden directors. So that was another perhaps a peculiarity of Australian gardens, that the German influence was perhaps above what you might expect.
I think with that, we better start wrapping up now, but thank you so much. I guess on behalf of the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, Richard, thank you for that's such an informative talk. And also on behalf of the audience members, I'll just comment, there's been a lot of thank yous coming through and thanking you for such a well-researched and illustrative presentation. So it was very much so enjoyed. And even a comment from Stuart about a part 2 would be appreciated maybe at some point in the future as well. So with that, I'd like to just thank our audience and everybody for attending today. We have all the previous talks that we have associated with the forum on our website, and any future events are also listed there. So you'll have seen Rachel has put a link in the chat box where you can find more of that information. Also, we are a members organization, so we encourage, if you'd like to join the Commonwealth Heritage Forum, we'd be more than happy for you to support us on continuing to promote heritage across the Commonwealth. So on that, thank you and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Amanda.